Hello and welcome to Out and Equal's July 2016 monthly town call, what HR, D&I, and business leaders need to know to support transgender employees. My name is Daniel Lawrence Smith, Associate Director of Training. A few housekeeping before we begin. Remember that this is a broadcast audio call. It will be 1 hour long, and we will record this as a digital archive, and that will be available after the session. Please be sure to turn up the volume on your speakers or headsets. A few announcements at Out and Equal. August 11th will be our monthly trainers forum for all of you who have taken our Train the Trainer and our Out and Equal certified trainers. August 25th will be our next monthly town call. How do we respond? Does my company sound LGBT? And with that, we'll be discussing some of the recent events that affected the LGBT and ally communities, such as the tragedies in Mexico City, Orlando shootings, and laws that are stripping us of vital rights and protections. And for that, we will be joined by Bob Wittick from Wittick Communications. September 28th will be our global town call with perspectives on Italy. September 29th will be our town call on ERG-BRG development. And of course, October 4th through 7th will be our 2016 Out and Equal Workplace Summit in Orlando, Florida. Our Leadership Day will be held on Tuesday, October 4th. Before we begin, I'd like to begin by a brief poll. So we're going to ask for your active participation during this call. And the first question is, does your company have a gender identity non-discrimination policy? And go ahead and put in your answer there and then hit submit, and we'll be able to see the results in real time. Great. We've got about 200 folks joining us on the call so far, so about half of you have put in your responses. And we're seeing an overwhelming amount, almost 80% saying yes. Smaller portion, about 3%, no, but adding one soon. A fair amount, about 15% of you saying that you're not sure yet, so definitely something to find out there. Thank you all. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And this is, does your company have an approved transition plan for transgender employees? And go ahead and click all that might apply here. Okay. And we've got about, again, half of you that have put in your answers. Give it another moment here. Great. What we're seeing is it's about 50-50 of folks who say yes, approved and implemented, but also a fair amount that say that you're not sure. So about 30% yes, implemented, but also about 30% not sure. About 10% that it's in draft form, no, but planning to get one. Wonderful. Great. And for our last question, if your company has a plan in place, has the plan been used with someone who is transitioning at work? Again, check all that apply. Okay. Give it just another moment here. And what we're seeing is about 30%, over 30%, not that you know of. A fair amount, about 15%, saying it's not applicable. But what's great to see is that about 14% are saying yes, and it worked great. And about 20% yes, and we learned a lot. So that's very encouraging to see that. So thank you all for your input and participation. We will ask for you to type in questions throughout the call, and we will address those during our Q&A at the end. With that, we have a fantastic group of panelists, and I'd like them each to briefly introduce themselves, and we'll begin on the left with Jenna.
Thanks, Daniel. I am Jenna Cook. I have been at J&J for about 10 years, so that's Johnson & Johnson. I transitioned on the job about 4 years ago, and at that time we really didn't have a transition plan, and that actually spurred myself and other colleagues to generate one. And about that time I also joined O&E, the TAC, where we took those thoughts to the TAC and working with others, we generated transition guidelines for O&E, and that's in part the subject of the talk today. And let's see. I think that's it. I think I'll leave it there, and I'll hand it over to Andre.
Hi, I'm Andre Wilson. I'm Senior Associate at Jameson Green & Associates, where I've worked for about the last 10 years, largely on transgender inclusive health insurance, but also on a range of other transgender health and workplace issues. And I'm very pleased to be on the call today.
So I guess I'm up, yes? This is Jameson Green. I am a consultant, as Andre mentioned, with Jameson Green & Associates, and I have been working with corporate training and transgender advocacy for over 25 years. And I've also just finished being the president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health for 2 years and 5 months. And now I continue on the WPATH Executive Committee for another 2 years. So I'm basically very, very excited to work with Out and Equal, which I've also been doing for about at least 16 years, definitely, probably a little longer than that. So also thanks for having me on the call today. Appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. This is Lori Fox. I live in the Chicago area. I am a LGBT business and diversity consultant working with a whole variety of diversity of corporations in the area of LGBT issues and specializing in assisting companies and individuals who are transitioning in putting together workplace transition plans. Previously, I was a director of human resources for a Fortune 100 company, and I serve on the National Board of Directors of Out and Equal, and it's a real pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I think this is my cue. It's my face there. So I'm going to talk about the guidelines. Probably many of you know, or I hope most of you know, that Out and Equal does have workplace transition guidelines. They are available on their website. You go to their website and their resources. You'll find the guidelines there. They are about a year old. They were released right before O&E, informally at O&E last year. It's version 1. And right now we have version 2 out. And Pat just put the link up in the chat box so you can see it all there. And for the guidelines, I want to say they are a work in progress. Like that they're now version 2. We and I say the members of the Transgender Advisory Committee work to update those. We keep our pulse on what's going on in industry and society, and we want to create and have available to folks the most updated and revised copy of the guidelines that we can. Really to embody the most current thinking and all the changes that may be happening. So just a couple of thoughts that we have for possible revisions going into perhaps version 3, and we're looking to possibly revise them at least once a year. And with the next revision, some of the items that we're looking at, perhaps more detailed steps for the transition process. That's currently in one of the appendices for the guidelines. Process for insurance implementation. That is pretty much a hot button topic, and Andre will actually talk a little bit more about that, but in part to ensure how we have adequate insurance coverage that meets WPATH standards. and it's in accordance with recent industry changes, and also expanding considerations for gender diverse individuals. So the guidelines are a living document, and we hope that for the folks that are thinking about a gender transition policy and gender identity guidelines, that they're available and they're meant to be used really as is, or can be revised. And let's talk about that. And so using the guidelines. So the process of plan development and approval for the guidelines, if your company doesn't have transition guidelines or gender identity guidelines, actually gender identity and transition guidelines, it's actually it actually covers both. But how that may actually be developed and approved within the company depends on the company size. Obviously, if it's a larger company, they may have, what we call an Office of Diversity and Inclusion. They may have an employee resource group or a business resource group, the DRG, obviously HR, benefits, and other departments that may be involved in how to incorporate and develop really company-wide guidelines. If you're using guidelines, or when using the guidelines, adopting the guidelines, it's very important to identify an owner of the document, one that will actually work on the document, email the document around, shepherd the document, make any changes to the document, if there's to be any. So it's really important to identify an owner. That way they kind of don't just sit somewhere and somebody's wondering, well, who's working on them, who has them, what's going on. So I indicated that the guidelines can be used as is, which they can be. They were written to be pretty much used as is, or most likely they can be shaped for the company itself. Obviously, no two companies are the same. They may have different needs and wants. Some things may be a better fit than others. They may want to add something unique to their business. So it's important to approach the guidelines as a multifaceted tool that can be used really to create a more inclusive work environment. It also can be used, there's many of you that indicate that you have guidelines, may also be used to update existing guidelines, fresh ideas, fresh perspective. Because, again, that's what we try to bring to the guidelines, at least on a yearly basis. And obviously they can be used to assist employees who are transitioning, trying to create a more inclusive work environment. So I alluded to a cross-functional team that could shape the guidelines for internal use. It could be part of a toolkit. Using them just as is, they could be, that easily can be done. But again, just characterizing them just for your individual situation that may not work. It may be a very specific type of company with specific needs. So revising them, to fit the company and also the individuals in a particular situation isn't necessarily a bad thing. And since transitioning is, it's not one size fits all. There are no two transitions who are different. Companies may not have the expertise in, fully understanding and grasping, to being on board with gender identity guidelines, helping someone transition. It's highly recommended that, one use an external consultant. Because in something like this, something that you really want to get right, experience really does matter. And there are many folks on the TAC that have that experience. It's not an advertisement, mind you, for the TAC, but there are many folks on the ONE Transgender Advisory Committee that have a wealth of experience in this area. And hence that's why we created the guidelines. Guideline approval. So once you have a document, what do you do with it? it may not necessarily be that easy to get it approved within the company, because now you may be going to senior leaders. So once you have the final agreement on the guideline content, you really do want to make sure that you have all the key players involved as it approaches its final stage. So HR, benefits, if there's an Office of Diversity, legal, communication, and all the appropriate senior management. You don't want to catch anybody by surprise when developing gender identity and transition guidelines within the company. As we know now, even in society, our political landscape is kind of a hot-button topic, and some people can be very polarized on how they may approach something like this. So you definitely want to make sure that you have everyone's buy-in, such that there are no surprises, nothing gets stalled, and nothing gets buried by the wayside. Another aspect that I found is that once the guidelines process is in place, develop a method for updating the document fairly quickly instead of having to go through an expensive multi-level review. It'll definitely save a lot of headaches in the future. Now, once you have the guidelines, an important aspect is their communication strategy for their release. How are employees within the company going to be made aware that the guidelines exist? You can have the most beautiful, perfect guidelines policies ever, and if nobody knows they exist, nobody can find them, they're not going to be much use. So what is going to be the role of HR and management and also the employees in learning about really how inclusive the company is now if they have these types of guidelines? Because in having the guidelines, you're going to have certain benefits, and it's not just the employees that have that benefit, those benefits rather, but it's also the dependents of those employees. And is there a go-to person for the guidelines that may or may not be the same as the owner of the guidelines? Now, for myself, I'm the global transition liaison for the company. So anybody who would actually transition within Johnson & Johnson, they can come to me for advice. And that would be advice that would just be between me and them. It wouldn't go to HR, it wouldn't go to their management, it wouldn't go to anybody. So having someone like that, perhaps someone who's transitioned within the company already, that would be a real bonus for other people, and also sets a really good positive tone within the company that the company itself is willing to have such a position. Another item is, where will the guidelines reside internally? I alluded to, will they be easily found? If somebody is thinking, okay, well, today's the day, I want to transition, I'm coming out within the company, and the thought is, well, how am I going to do this? And I thought I saw something that the company has some policy, some document or something that's like, where are they going to go? Where are they going to find that? Is it going to be visible on the HR site, benefits, Office of Diversity, what have you? And then who will administer the guidelines? Is that going to be from HR or from, say, an Office of Diversity and Inclusion? The guidelines, one thing that they can be used for is benchmarking for the HRC's Corporate Equality Index, the DEI. Many companies are still working towards and continuing on with obtaining their 100% rating, and having guidelines in place will facilitate that. These particular guidelines can be helped to fulfill the transgender component of this DEI, because if you are using the guidelines to their fullest, then you're offering insurance without exclusion in accordance with WPATH standards of care, and that then indicates that you have at least one insurance policy offering medically necessary health care services and the coverage. So that includes mental health counseling, pharmacy benefits, laboratory services, surgical benefits, short-term paid leave, and others. It could be, travel, other sources, associated types of medical leave and such. And Andre will talk a little bit more about that. Now, with the guidelines, if you have guidelines, and if somebody has transitioned within the company, is there a follow-up process? Does someone check to see how things went or how things are actually going with a transition? Is there an evaluation of, say, the transition team? Is there any feedback to the guidelines so that they can be revised if needed? And what happens to employees who transition within the company? Do they stay? Do they leave? Are they promoted? Do they seek another job? How satisfied were they with the overall process, the support, et cetera? And one thing you can ask is, are the guidelines global? And that could be a whole separate topic unto itself, implementation of gender identity guidelines in a global environment, because so many different companies operate in so many different environments. Laws are extremely diverse within different companies in countries. So that's something that is not an easy thing to do. So I just want to summarize a little bit that with the guidelines and having guidelines, it is an important aspect for the company. As we all know, gender identity and expression, they're developing. Younger people, they're not really being aligned to the stereotypical barriers. They're dissolving them and they're changing them. They're changing their interpretation. They're definitely not tied to past convention, and they're really coming to expect the greater freedom, and with that, there's associated expectations that this isn't just the same old anymore. So they can, a lot of younger people are starting to look at companies a lot differently. So also having these guidelines, companies need to be competitive and retain top talent. It's important that people see the company that they're working for, even as a senior executive, that this is the place that I want to be, that I'm proud to be here, and I'm proud to bring on other people. And so they need to consider the expectations of their employees. And one of those that's very visible nowadays is general neutral bathrooms. And the last point I wanted to make is the T is not going away anytime soon, perhaps much to the ilk of perhaps a lot of people, but I won't go down that road. Just last month, the Williams Institute has they put out another document, how many adults identify as transgender in the U.S., and that effectively doubles the consensus of the amount of people thought to be transgender from 0.3% to 0.6%, meaning that it's about 1.4 million people. So it's important that we have guidelines, processes, thought processes in place to actually help those who are transgender and are seeking to live their authentic lives in the workplace. Okay, with that, I think Andre is up next.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jenna. I'm going to talk a little bit about transgender inclusive coverage in our health insurance and health benefits plans. I think many of you are very familiar with the Corporate Equality Index and have been working to get transgender inclusive health coverage and those 10 points out of 100 in the Corporate Equality Index. And we talk a lot in the employee resource groups and elsewhere about the reasons why transgender inclusive coverage is important. It's important to have a company image that really centers around diversity, that we communicate to consumers and clients about our commitment to diversity. Having policies in place is one of the ways we do that. It's also important as we want to attract and retain valuable employees. And also around, as Jenna was saying, authenticity in the workplace. Employees being able to bring themselves to work and not have to hide who they are. I think something that isn't talked about enough is we should anticipate lowered costs with deliver right health care. Whatever that health care is that people need, if they're getting it, their health care needs are addressed. If they're not getting it, they're having other kinds of health care needs because their health care is declining. So putting policy in practice is also important, so making sure if we say we're not going to discriminate on the basis of gender identity, as many of our corporate policies now do, making sure we don't discriminate in health plans is also important. So many of you are part of companies that really have done a lot of work in this area and have really helped us move forward by registering your great policies through the Corporate Equality Index, letting folks know what you've done, and keeping doing it. And so what's happened actually, because so many of you have moved forward, we've moved the world forward. And so I want to talk now about where we are into a larger regulatory picture. A decade ago, we weren't here. We weren't talking about a larger regulatory picture, and now we are. And I want to say this really is because of so many of you and your companies that are on the call today. We have been able to change policies in large part because we had examples of health plans and health insurance plans with inclusive coverage, and we were able to demonstrate the importance of it. Today, we have the Affordable Care Act, and there's a very important provision in the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557, which is the non-discrimination section. And it doesn't specify non-discrimination specifically on gender identity, but it does specify non-discrimination in the delivery of services and in the health plans on the basis of sex. And in a couple of years ago, Health and Human Services issued an opinion that sex included gender identity. Gender identity is a component of sex. This is consistent with other regulatory agencies in the federal government, other departments of the federal government. It's also consistent with court decisions going back over a decade, perhaps beginning, in fact, with a Sixth Circuit Court decision, which is important to me. I live in Michigan, that defined gender identity as a component of sex and furthered the Price Waterhouse decision, which many of us are familiar with. In May of 2016, Health and Human Services issued a final regulation about gender identity as a component of sex and what it would mean to not discriminate on the basis of gender identity. Now, this decision affects Medicare, Medicaid, and the marketplace, those three M's. And I think importantly for many of the companies and the company representatives on the call today, the language that's used is that it applies to issuers that participate in the marketplace. And it's important to understand that issuers are very often, issuers in the marketplace are also often third-party administrators of self-insured plans. And so it is through these issuers that many of our self-insured plans at large companies are also falling under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. And the final regulation issued will take effect specifically with plans starting in 2017. When you get the PowerPoint, the document that you see on the right should click to the link to Health and Human Services that tells more about the decision. So what does it do, this regulation? And I have to say, so Section 1557 has existed since the beginning of the Affordable Care Act, so it actually has been in force all of this time. And Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights has taken complaints and educated complaints for a couple of years now. But this is a regulation that clarifies what has been, what they have been coming to terms with in those complaints. So Section 1557 under this regulation specifically prohibits sex discrimination in healthcare and coverage, and this includes gender identity and sex stereotyping. People cannot be denied health care or health coverage based on their sex, and coverage is required that's consistent with gender identity. Plans may not limit coverage based on gender, so access to sex-specific services like prostate exams, pelvic exams, urinary exams, various types of cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, whatever it is, those services, those conditions are not limited based on gender, and if people need those services, they have access to them. Categorical exclusions for gender transition are discriminatory under the Affordable Care Act, under this new regulation regarding the Affordable Care Act. However, there's no mandate for coverage of gender transition. I think that's important to note. But all exclusions for gender transition are considered discriminatory. So a question arises, what kind of enforcement will happen for anyone, but also for self-insured plans? So for fully insured plans, complaints would be addressed to Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights, that's OCR, and they address them on a case-by-case basis. There's a little bit of a difference with the self-insured plans. The Office for Civil Rights suggests that the third-party administrator is responsible for any violations in the administration of the plan, but the employer or plan sponsor is responsible for the benefits design. And this is really critical for us to understand because the employer plan sponsor then becomes responsible, but because the Affordable Care Act doesn't apply to the employer's plan sponsors, a different agency then jumps in. So the Health and Human Services lacks jurisdiction over the employer, and those cases about benefit design, would go to the EEOC, to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And that's significant, I think. So for the the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, what they're implementing is Title VII, which prohibits sex discrimination in the terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. And health insurance is one of those privileges of employment. And there's been, over the last couple of years, a series of EEOC cases relevant to transgender exclusions in health insurance and also to other employment issues faced by transgender employees. And I think we're seeing an increasing number of the employment cases involving transgender employees. An increasing number are now including benefits discrimination as part of the discrimination claim, and we've now seen damages associated with those claims awarded. And in particular, I want to note the EEOC versus Deluxe Financial Services Corporation. So $115,000 of damages was awarded in that case. And I have to say, I think that's a significant amount for an employer to be looking at. And I would suspect that as we move forward and both the EEOC and other courts become more familiar with transgender people, transgender health care, I think we may begin to see damages rise so that they're not simply limited to direct costs, but actually also to kinds of damages incurred by a transgender individual experiencing discrimination. So again, benefits design, which would include whether or not there's an exclusion in your plan, would go to the EEOC, whereas benefits administration will go to Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. And I think we've all experienced this, that there is some gray area there about what exactly is relevant to benefit design and what is relevant to benefits administration. I also want to note that there are now state regulations in, actually it is 18 states and jurisdictions. I will personally include D.C. as a state, but this list is lacking Montana. So we now have state regulations in all of those states which suggest that the exclusions are discriminatory, which state that the exclusions are discriminatory. So if your health plan falls under state regulation, as it would in a fully insured plan, for example, then those state regulations would also apply. And I won't go into them here, just to say that there are some significant differences between those state regulations and that would be worth paying attention to if your plans fall under them. So for employers and plan sponsors, it's really important at this moment that you review your plan design. So review that plan design immediately for the 2017 plan year and be proactive. I would suggest reviewing all plan documents and meeting with those third-party administrators and carriers. Make sure that all of your offerings, now I want to say, remember that when we were dealing with the Corporate Equality Index, Human Rights Campaign only required that a single plan be transgender inclusive. At this point in time, every plan offering must eliminate those transgender exclusions. Whether or not they're explicitly inclusive, that's not mandated under this new regulation, but none of them can have transgender exclusions. And I should also note, I had meant to include it as a bullet point, but I didn't, that many of the employers that created transgender inclusive plans in the last decade or so, many of them have retained some level of transgender exclusion in the plan. It's now important to go back and make sure that those exclusions are removed, because even a transgender exclusion, even in a plan that has some level of inclusion, that transgender exclusion is now impermissible. So again, going back to look at both benefit design and benefits administration to make sure that plans don't discriminate. So you'll need to remove those exclusions for gender transition services. You need to ensure that health services are covered regardless of a person's sex. So making sure that what we've in the past may have called women's health care is now available explicitly to all individuals regardless of sex. It's crucially important. It's still important, regardless of whether it's mandated under a federal regulation. It's still important to provide explicit coverage of gender transition-related care. Why is it important? Well, for the same reason it was required under the Corporate Equality Index criteria. Because if it's not explicitly covered, your employees will still be in doubt. Those who may need those services, they'll still be in doubt. So it's very important to communicate to employees that coverage is affirmatively there. It's also now important, as part of that, and has been important, to ensure coverage of what we've called all medically necessary services. So all services related to transgender transition when they're necessary in order to address the medical condition related, so to address gender dysphoria. These are considered medically necessary when the service is clinically indicated for that individual through an assessment and treatment process with a medical provider. And again, we know this isn't a free-for-all. This is something where an individual is in treatment, working with their provider. They've gone through an assessment process, and they've identified a treatment plan and the services that are going to be important in alleviating their gender dysphoria. The same services do not work for everybody, so it's very important that the individualized services that people need are covered. And in order to help folks understand the range of possible services, this slide gives an indication of the vast majority, perhaps not all. We always have a caveat, in part because new services may come into being this year, next month, that we're not aware of that may become crucially important in the treatment of gender dysphoria. But these are services that are very commonly used, again, not by everyone, but by the people who need these services. Hormone replacement therapy, a variety of forms of surgical reconstruction services, including breast and chest services, reproductive surgeries, genital surgeries, but also other kinds of reconstructive procedures, including hair removal services, facial hair removal services, masculinizing and feminizing facial reconstruction services. I know there was a question earlier about whether companies are covering the feminizing facial reconstruction, and the answer is yes, an increasing number of companies are, and there are even some insurance carriers in some states that have made it part of their medical guideline, and I believe there's even a state Medicaid plan at this point that is now also covering those services. We're seeing a much greater understanding. When these services are covered, it's because there's a greater understanding that when people are transitioning, we're not treating them to change them into a man or change them into a woman. We are treating people in order to treat gender dysphoria. And what treats an individual's gender dysphoria is individualized for each person. And so we don't have a cookie-cutter approach to this. So I would encourage folks, this is often a tough list for people to look at. It's hard to think about surgical services, but we always encourage people, especially those who are negotiating with the insurance company and you're trying to ensure that the services people need are covered. We really encourage people to be familiar with these services, become familiar and able to say the word so that you can ask about them and ensure affirmatively that these services will be covered for folks. So again, benefit design, we've gone over that. Benefits administration is also important. And even though the employer or plan sponsor may not be directly responsible for benefits administration, it's crucial in order for you to ensure that your employees are getting the services that they need and that they're not being discriminated against. It's important to ensure that the third-party administrator or insurance carrier is really doing the job they need to be doing. So facilitating name and gender changes. We recommend developing experts, whether it's a point person or a team, whether it's in HR or at the third-party administrator. We're seeing that actually having experts, developing experts, people who are the go-to people for these particular issues, they're often the keepers of the history of the process as well, and that's important. Medical guidelines that follow the standards of care are crucial, and I think we'll let Jameson go over that in a moment, but we're really talking again about individual health needs. So again, reviewing the benefit design, the fundamental goals are unchanged. It's the right health care that people need to lower cost, attracting, retaining employees. It's the same thing. And remember, we've moved the world forward because you've moved the world forward. We'll talk more about this at the Out and Equal Summit. We're be giving a workshop, Transgender Healthcare. I believe it's on the Friday of the summit, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andre. So people have asked, what is WPATH? And it is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is a professional association founded in 1979, comprised mostly of physicians, surgeons, endocrinologists, primary care doctors, a lot of different physician specialties, psychologists, psychiatrists who are a physician specialty, but also psychologists, social workers, and generally people who provide medical and healthcare services to transgender people, and also has a component of attorneys, social science researchers, speech and language therapists, a lot of different people whose work also impacts the lives of transgender people. The organization was founded essentially to promote research and education and to promote dialogue within the interdisciplinary field of transgender health. So WPATH published first standards of care in 1979, and they are now revised to version 7, which was published in 2012. And for the first time, the standards are actually evidence-based now. And we have issued a clarification statement on medical necessity in 2008 that has been essentially incorporated into the 2012 version 7 standards of care. And all services that are provided to treat gender dysphoria are medically necessary in WPATH's opinion. And WPATH is considered the global expert on these matters. It is relied upon by the federal government, the State Department, Health and Human Services, and also by numerous courts and also governments around the world in developing policies that affect transgender people. So the guidelines are global and subject to modification for local, cultural, and legal requirements. So that the version of the document, there's a link on the slide that'll take you directly to the page where the standards of care exist. It's a very educational document, actually, and I would encourage you, if you're learning about this and focusing particularly on healthcare issues, to avail yourself of this free document, which is available now in 12 languages, and we are working on additional languages. So as I said, it's very educational, and it will explain a great deal about the history of transgender treatment and the current status of how it goes. But the reason I brought up the international stuff, it's a global document, so it doesn't 100% apply to or reflect the healthcare delivery structure in any particular country. So it's a little bit general in that regard, and so sometimes certain different countries will need specific implementation aspects of it. But that it's there, it's all there, and it will be very, very useful to you if that interests you. WPATH's value, as I mentioned, is to employers and employees, and insurance companies also cite the WPATH standards of care in their medical guidelines for gender dysphoria treatments, and law and government also relies on these standards. Medical service providers rely on them. And what we're facing now are the adequacy of network issues. Now that more and more insurance companies are offering in the United States, I'll just speak about the United States. Now that more and more companies are offering insurance coverage, we are finding, which we knew would happen, frankly, that there are not enough providers that are skilled in this care to address the great need that occurs across the country. In other countries, for example, in Western Europe, all this treatment is covered under national health in virtually every Western European country. So it's something that is just automatically there. Different other countries like India, it's much more difficult. But it's complicated, and I don't want to get into all of that. What we need still is lots and lots of education and lots more research. So we're still definitely working on that, and I want to jump ahead to Lori, and so we can wrap this up with some Q&A time.
Okay. Thanks, James. And I know we are running, we're about out of time, and so there have been a whole bunch of questions, and we will be following up with the responses to those questions. But just very briefly, I kind of summarize what others have said about the importance of having a plan, the importance of making sure that before someone comes to you, if you are in HR, in management, that you have a plan ready. Could you move to the next slide? The importance of reviewing, as we talk about that second bullet point, a culture of inclusion, and that is really looking at all of your policies, looking at all of the, the insurance issues. The bathroom issues and religious issues will definitely come up. I've done a lot of training with a variety of companies around the country. Those two issues always come up. So we coach people to make sure you know how to address those issues in training, and it's very important knowing that there are going to be some people who struggle with that. And if you could move to the next slide. In kind of in a summary here, if you follow from the top left down, some very small things that are so important. Out of dignity and respect, using correct names and pronouns, treating employees in transition with dignity and respect. People just want to live their authentic selves. The third one, refrain from asking inappropriate questions or making inappropriate comments. Once again, it's about respecting your colleagues, respecting maybe it's your supervisor or other individuals. It's so important to refrain from that. Respect employees' privacy and confidentiality. Because gender dysphoria, identifying as transgender is still considered a medical issue, there are confidentiality issues here that need to be respected. In your training, in your culture, be inclusive. And as you hear things out in the workplace, the importance of listening with intention. It is so important to understand what you're hearing, what is the buzz going on when someone transitions, and that frankly, to many people, it's none of their business when someone transitions. But you've got to listen. Recognizing that we all have bias, we all have prejudice. And to look at that in our own selves, and as we see someone else or as we're struggling with an issue, knowing that we need to all look at our bias. Be supportive, and in part of a culture of inclusion. And the last one is, maintaining a commitment to learn and grow as an individual and as an organization. So with that, I will turn it back over, I believe, to Daniel. And because we've seen a lot of questions that will need to be addressed.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Lori, Jameson, Andre, and Jenna. And yeah, there was a fantastic wealth of questions that came in, but so much great content as well. So what we're going to do as a follow-up to this call, again, the call will be recorded, and that recording will be made available along with a PDF of all the slides. And what we'll also do is include a resource document with the questions that came in as well as the answers that go according to that. So that will be made available to each and every one of you. With that, I'd like to turn it back to the panel briefly for some closing comments. And why don't we begin with Jenna?
Thanks, Daniel. My closing comment is that, I indicated that the P is not going away. It is so important that we have those inclusive policies within our workplace, that, we work to support those individuals who identify as transgender. so that they can bring their entire authentic selves to work and not be afraid to do so, because so much suffers. They suffer, their work suffers. That's the case. The company will suffer, and it's just nobody wins. So I just think it's really important that we move to a space where we are okay. If we're not living within that strict binary anymore, because it's not there. It's changing.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you. I think there have been a lot of great questions about some of the specifics around medical coverage, and these are the kind of things that we as consultants deal with. I also encourage everyone, again, to come to Out and Equal, to the summit, and I think some of those questions would be better to talk about there when we have a little bit more time. Great questions, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Jameson?
Thanks, Daniel. I just want to commend all of you who are here with us today for your interest and your commitment to equality. And transgender people are nothing to be afraid of, and it's just a matter of familiarity. And I think that is increasing at an incredibly rapid pace these days, and I think I'm very, very optimistic in spite of many apparent setbacks. I'm still very optimistic that we can achieve full equality and fairness and all of those wonderful values that I think we all share. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And Lori?
My brief message would be to not only to senior management, to supervisors, to colleagues, and to remember, and to HR, and to remember that we should all be judged by the work we do and not by our sexual orientation and gender identity, because we all want to focus on the work of the organization that you belong to so that we can make the world a much better place. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Jenna, Andre, Jameson, and Lori, for providing so much great content and conversation. We really appreciate your insights. And, of course, thank you to all of you on the call for your participation and your interest in having this discussion. Again, our Out and Equal Workplace Summit will be October 4th through 7th in Orlando, Florida. For more information, you can check out our website. And a reminder that this call has been recorded and will be available as a digital archive. You will receive a follow-up message after the call that will include a link to the recording. We will also have a PDF of the presentation. And as mentioned, because we did have so much great content and conversation today, we will include a resource document that includes the answers to all of your fantastic questions. Please join us for our next monthly town call on August 25th. How do we respond? Does my company sound LGBT? We'll be joined by Bob Wittick of Wittick Communications. There will be a brief survey at the end of the call, and your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to fill that out. Again, on behalf of Out and Equal, thank you all so much for your participation today, and enjoy the rest of your day.